Food waste isn't only moldy, rotten, or spoiled food, but also the countless leftover meals and food that didn't get sold at the grocery store. Today, we are going to look at food waste at the consumer level and how it's affecting our environment. Did you know the US wastes around 119 billion pounds of food annually? That's roughly 40% of our entire food supply. In total, this equals more than $408 billion and accounts for nearly 130 billion meals thrown away every single year. The two biggest sources of this incomprehensible amount of food waste shockingly comes from the US households and grocery stores. The average US household, consisting of a family of four, wastes nearly a third of all of their food, and the grocery stores aren't much better, wasting around 30% of all the food sold on their floors. Think of the savings of the potential reduction in food waste Missouri could achieve if we're able to marginally improve on some of these national averages. As you can see, food is wasted from the time it reaches the grocery store, when it reaches your pantry, and every step in between. The flow of food at the consumer level is a bit more complex, but the ability to combat this problem can be achieved.
Although it's difficult to predict how all food is distributed throughout Missouri, this diagram helps highlight just how easy food can be thrown away at the consumer level. As you can see, unsellable or quote unquote bad food from this grocery store can end up in one of three places: food banks, landfills, or in your pantry at a discounted price. When speaking on the food that gets to food banks, a lot of that food is simply thrown out before it's even able to be transferred to institutions handing it out. Furthermore, if this wasn't enough, even more food is thrown out at food pantries, and once more after it may get into the homes of those who may need it, and that's only if the food is still good before it gets there.
In continuing the conversation on food insecurity, food pantries and food banks get brought up a lot, but not everyone knows their differences. Food banks make up regional practices that often act as large distribution centers for food, whereas food pantries tend to be more local, are smaller, and operate at the consumer level. In a highly inflationary capitalist system, not everyone is able to meet their basic necessities. Food pantries and food banks currently play a vital role in the movement of food in communities where it's most needed. Although food banks and food pantries aren't necessarily directly related to food waste in its entirety, understanding these communities and the situations of those that are most affected might lend towards growth in both issues.
In attempting to understand some of the big picture issues on the topic of food waste, you can see that there is no precise idea of how we might collectively better utilize wasted foods. In our research, the continuation of potentially unnecessary food waste at the consumer level, and more specifically the issue of food insecurity, comes down to one reason: a lack of resources. Let me ask you a simple question. How much do you genuinely care about all the ways in which food might be wasted, knowing that there's still people going hungry every day? Outside the efforts Outside the efforts made by food banks and food pantries, there are many national programs attempting to increase the accessibility of food to those in need and to further utilize food that might otherwise be thrown out. The National School Lunch Program provides nutritionally balanced, low-cost, or free lunches to children each day at schools across the nation. The Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, or SNAP, provides nutrition benefits to supplement the food budgets of needy families. Electronic Benefits Transfer, or EBT, or also known as food stamps, allows the individuals that qualify for SNAP benefits to pay for their food at local retailers. Despite food insecurity and food waste being separate issues, the intersectionality may lend towards the notion that growth in one may simultaneously help improve the other.
This concept was really highlighted in our networking efforts with Bill McKelvey, Senior Project Coordinator for the University of Missouri Interdisciplinary Center for Food Security. In this interview, he really showed us the interconnectedness of food insecurity and food waste. For example, he had worked with a rural community in the past that had 4 food pantries in the same small town. He mentioned that each food pantry wasn't in contact with each other and that they weren't necessarily coordinating their schedules to meet the needs and timelines of the community. That said, after finishing his work with them, he said simply improving upon the communication of these institutions and coordinating their cumulative efforts did the accessibility and reliability of each food pantry improve. Although we can't be sure this community reduced their food waste at the end of the day, we can see how improving these institutions might. There are aspects to the food waste problem that go beyond the numbers and science. Understanding and improving upon the communication and logistics of the institutions serving the food insecurity issue may not slow down the inevitable decomposition of an apple, but it may help get that apple in the hands of someone that needs it before it goes bad.
Now that we have talked about how food is wasted at the consumer level and ways to try to mitigate the impact of food waste, let's go into the effects it has on the environment when it does not make it to the consumer. There are two areas where there is a very large impact on the environment from food waste: food production and landfilled food. Primary food production makes up 48% of all greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. More specifically, it is responsible for 39% of all U.S. methane emissions and 80% of all U.S. nitrous oxide emissions. Currently, there are 2,635 landfills in the United States and 679 in the Midwest. Roughly 292.4 million tons of municipal solid waste is dumped in each landfill per year. More specifically, 30 to 40% of landfilled solid waste is food waste, or roughly 75 billion pounds yearly, which decomposes at a much slower rate than in nature due to the lack of oxygen in landfills. And with that is the end of this presentation regarding food waste and the impacts of food waste in the U.S. and more specifically in Missouri.